welcome to Mail Story. If you enjoy stories, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next ones.
3 hours after my cancer diagnosis, my husband called and said, I emptied the bank accounts because I'm not wasting our savings on someone who's dying. I was still sitting in the hospital parking lot trying to process that I had stage 2 breast cancer when my phone rang and Keith's voice was calm, like he was telling me about the weather. I've withdrawn all the money from our accounts. $68,000. I'm not throwing good money after bad on treatments that probably won't work. I couldn't speak because I thought I'd misheard him. What do you mean you took everything? He sighed like I was being slow. The survival rates for your type aren't great. Maybe 60%. I'm not gambling our life savings on those odds. I need to protect my future. I checked my banking app and everything was gone. Checking, savings, even the emergency fund we'd built over 15 years. That's my money too. Half of it came from my salary. He laughed and it was cold. You won't be working anymore. Cancer patients can't handle real jobs. I'm the only income now, so I make the financial decisions. I was a teacher with excellent insurance, but he'd already decided I was dying. I need that money for treatment, for bills while I'm in chemo. He was quiet for a moment, then said, Your parents can help you. Or start a crowdfunding thing. People love sob stories about teachers with cancer. My parents were retired on a fixed income, and he knew that. Where are you? I heard traffic in the background and a woman laughing. I'm taking a break. This diagnosis is hard on me too. I need space to process. The woman laughed again and I recognized the voice. His coworker Brittany was 23 and had been texting him constantly. You're with Brittany? He didn't deny it. She understands what I'm going through. Watching someone you love deteriorate is traumatic. I need support. I hadn't even started treatment yet, but he was already grieving me. I'm your wife. I just got diagnosed 3 hours ago and you're with another woman? He got defensive. Don't make this about you. Everything's always about you. Now you have cancer and it'll be all about you for however long you last. I deserve to think about myself for once. We'd been married 12 years and I'd supported him through 2 failed businesses and paid off his gambling debts twice. You're leaving me because I got sick? He corrected me quickly. I'm not leaving. That would look bad. I'm just protecting assets and getting emotional support elsewhere. You can stay in the house for now. For now. Like he was doing me a favor letting me stay in my own home. The mortgage is in both our names. He had an answer ready. But you won't be able to pay it without my income. Don't worry, I'll let you stay until you need hospice care. He'd already planned my death. That night he came home at 2 a.m. smelling like perfume and alcohol. We need to talk about logistics. He sat at the kitchen table with a folder. I've consulted with a lawyer. Since you're likely terminal, I can file for divorce on grounds of inevitable abandonment. I stared at him. That's not a real thing. He smiled. It is, if you word it right. Irretrievable breakdown due to medical circumstances beyond control. My lawyer says judges are sympathetic to healthy spouses trapped by sick partners. He pushed papers toward me. Sign these. It'll make everything cleaner. The papers were giving him everything. The house, the cars, even my teacher's pension. I'm not signing anything. He stood up angry. You're being selfish. Think about my future. I'm 38. I can still have a family with someone healthy. We'd tried for years to have children, but he'd refused to get tested, saying it was probably my fault. Get out. He laughed. This is my house. I'm the only one with income now, remember? I called my brother Ryan that night. He drove 3 hours and arrived at dawn. Keith was in the shower when Ryan walked in. Pack your things and leave. Keith came out in a towel. Who the hell are you to tell me to leave my house? Ryan pulled out his phone. I'm the person who has recordings of you admitting to stealing community property during a medical crisis. I hadn't told Ryan to record, but he'd been doing it since I'd called crying. Keith went pale. That's illegal recording. Ryan smiled. Not in a single-party consent state, and definitely not when you're stealing from a cancer patient. Keith tried to grab the phone, but Ryan was bigger. Also, my sister's oncologist is my best friend from medical school. Her prognosis is actually excellent. 90% survival rate with treatment. You didn't even ask for details before writing her off. Keith looked at me, shocked. I watched the color drain from his face like someone had opened a valve. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out, and when it did, his voice was higher than normal. He looked at me instead of Ryan, searching my face for something, maybe hoping I'd tell him it was a joke or a mistake. I kept my expression blank because I didn't owe him comfort or reassurance anymore. He'd written me off without asking a single question about my actual diagnosis, my actual treatment plan, my actual chances. He'd just assumed I was dying and made his choices based on that assumption. Ryan stepped closer to Keith and his voice stayed calm but got quieter, which somehow made it more threatening. He laid out exactly what happened next in simple terms that even Keith couldn't misunderstand. Every penny of that $68,000 got returned within 48 hours, not a day longer. Keith packed his things and moved out of the house immediately. He cooperated fully with the divorce proceedings without fighting or making demands. If Keith did all of that without complaint, Ryan would keep the recordings private. If Keith refused or tried to negotiate or caused any problems, Ryan would send the recordings to Keith's employer, to his parents, to his sister, and to anyone else who needed to know what kind of person he really was. Ryan would also file criminal charges for theft of community property during a medical emergency, which apparently was a real thing that prosecutors loved because it made them look good. Keith started shaking his head before Ryan even finished talking. He held up both hands like he was trying to stop traffic, and his voice came out panicked and rushed. He couldn't return the money that fast because he'd already spent some of it and he needed time to figure things out. Ryan's whole posture changed in a way that made me take a step back, even though I wasn't the one he was focused on. His jaw tightened and his eyes went cold, and he asked Keith exactly how much he'd spent, and on what. Keith looked at the floor and mumbled something I couldn't hear. Ryan told him to speak up and look at him when he talked. Keith's face flushed red, and he admitted he'd put a down payment on a new truck because his current one was getting old, and he'd been planning to upgrade anyway. He'd also taken Brittany on a weekend trip to a resort in the mountains because she'd been stressed at work and needed a break. The total was somewhere around $12,000 spent in 3 days. I felt something cold settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite hurt. It was more like clarity, the kind that comes when you finally see something you'd been avoiding looking at directly. He'd stolen our life savings hours after my cancer diagnosis, and immediately spent $12,000 on a truck and a vacation with his girlfriend. Not on anything important or necessary, not on bills or emergencies, on toys and entertainment while I sat alone trying to figure out how to pay for treatment. I heard my own voice before I decided to speak. I told Keith he had until tomorrow morning to figure out how to return all $68,000, or I was calling the police myself. Not 48 hours. Tomorrow morning. He could take out a loan, borrow from his parents, sell the truck he'd just bought, cancel the resort charges, or figure out some other solution, but the money needed to be back in my account by 9 a.m. Keith's eyes filled with tears, and he started talking fast about how he'd made a mistake, and panicked, and wasn't thinking clearly. He reached toward me, but I was already walking past him toward the bedroom. I couldn't stand to look at him anymore. Couldn't stand to be in the same room breathing the same air. I grabbed my overnight bag from the closet and started throwing clothes into it without really paying attention to what I was packing. I heard Keith following me and talking behind me, but his words didn't form into sentences in my brain. Ryan appeared in the doorway and told Keith to back off and give me space. Keith kept crying and saying he was sorry and he'd fix everything. I zipped the bag closed and walked past both of them without making eye contact. I stayed with my parents that night in my old bedroom that they'd turned into a guest room years ago. The bed was smaller than I remembered, and the walls were a different color, but the window still looked out at the same tree I used to climb as a kid. My mom sat with me on the edge of the bed and pulled me against her shoulder. She didn't say anything at first, just held me while I finally broke down completely. I'd been holding everything together since the diagnosis, staying calm and functional because that's what you do in a crisis. But sitting in my childhood bedroom with my mom's arms around me, I couldn't hold it anymore. The cancer diagnosis was terrifying in a way I couldn't fully process yet. My body had betrayed me, cells multiplying wrong, something growing inside me that wanted to kill me. But Keith's betrayal hurt worse somehow. The cancer wasn't personal. The cancer didn't choose to destroy me. Keith did. I'd chosen to trust him, to build a life with him, to support him through every failure and mistake. And when I needed him most, when I was most vulnerable and scared, he'd chosen to destroy me. He'd stolen my money, planned my death, and started a new relationship before I'd even processed the diagnosis. My mom stroked my hair and told me I was strong and I'd get through this. I wanted to believe her, but I felt hollowed out and exhausted. The next morning, I woke up to voices in the kitchen. Ryan was on the phone, and his voice had that sharp professional tone he used when he was handling business. I heard him say something about wire transfers and account numbers. I got dressed and walked out to find him drinking coffee at my parents' table. He told me Keith's attorney had called trying to negotiate more time and better terms. Ryan had shut him down immediately. The full amount got returned by noon, or he was moving forward with criminal charges. No extensions, no payment plans, no negotiations. I sat down and my dad pushed a plate of toast toward me even though I wasn't hungry. My phone buzzed with a banking notification at 11:47. $68,000 deposited via wire transfer. I stared at the screen until the numbers stopped looking like numbers and just became shapes. Ryan made another call and confirmed the transfer had cleared. He told someone on the other end that Keith could come get his things that afternoon, but Ryan would be there to supervise. I asked if I needed to be there, and Ryan said absolutely not. I should stay with mom and dad and let him handle it. That afternoon, I met with family law attorney Karen Hunter in her office downtown. Ryan had found her through a colleague, and she'd agreed to see me on short notice. She was maybe 50 with gray hair she didn't bother to dye, and sharp eyes that didn't miss anything. I told her everything from the beginning and watched her expression get colder with each detail. She asked specific questions about the timeline, the amounts, the recordings Ryan had made. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and told me she was furious on my behalf. She'd been practicing family law for 23 years, and she'd seen terrible things, but Keith's actions made her professionally and personally angry. What he'd done was financial abuse and possibly criminal theft, depending on how the prosecutor wanted to handle it. She explained that we had an extremely strong case for divorce and for recovering damages beyond just the principal amount. Keith had acted in bad faith, stolen community property during a medical emergency, and demonstrated clear intent to harm me financially. Any judge would see through whatever story his attorney tried to spin. She asked to hear Ryan's recordings and listened to them twice, making notes on a legal pad. When she finished, she told me the recordings were admissible in our state, and they were basically a gift from a legal standpoint. Keith had admitted everything in his own words, on tape, with clear timestamps. She started building a strategy right there, explaining how we'd file for divorce citing his misconduct, file a separate civil suit for damages, and potentially pursue criminal charges if he tried to fight us. She told me her standard rate and then said she was taking my case partially pro bono. She'd charge me a reduced fee because this level of cruelty offended her both professionally and personally, and she wanted to make sure I had the best representation possible. 2 days later, I had my first appointment with Dr. Jeremy Vickers at the Oncology Center. Ryan insisted on coming with me since Keith obviously wouldn't be there. The waiting room was quieter than I expected, full of people in various stages of treatment. Some had scarves covering bald heads, some looked healthy and normal, some were connected to portable IV poles. Dr. Vickers was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes and a calm manner that made me feel slightly less terrified. He went through my diagnosis in detail, explaining exactly what type of cancer I had and why my prognosis was genuinely excellent. The specific cellular markers in my tumor responded extremely well to chemotherapy. My age and overall health were major advantages. The cancer hadn't spread to my lymph nodes, which was crucial. With treatment, my 5-year survival rate was over 90%. He showed me scans and charts and explained everything in terms I could understand without talking down to me. Ryan asked technical questions about treatment protocols and drug combinations, and Dr. Vickers answered thoroughly. He laid out the treatment plan clearly. 6 months of chemotherapy starting next week, administered every 3 weeks. Each session would take about 4 hours. After the chemo finished, we'd do new scans to see how the tumors had responded. If they'd shrunk enough, I might not need radiation at all. If they hadn't shrunk as much as we hoped, we'd do targeted radiation to finish eliminating any remaining cancer cells. He acknowledged that the treatment would be difficult. Chemotherapy was poison designed to kill fast-growing cells, and it didn't discriminate perfectly between cancer cells and healthy cells. I'd lose my hair, feel exhausted, probably deal with nausea despite anti-nausea medication. But I was otherwise healthy and strong, which improved my chances of handling treatment well. He emphasized that this was temporary. 6 months of difficulty for decades of life afterward. When we left his office, I felt strange, like I was carrying 2 opposite feelings at once. Terror about the treatment ahead, and relief that I actually had good odds of surviving this. I had to go to work the next morning because missing more days would mean arranging substitute coverage, and I wasn't ready to explain everything to my principal yet. My students were doing a reading activity when Morris knocked on my classroom door during his morning rounds. He asked if I had a moment to chat in the hallway, and I followed him out with my stomach tight because principals never pull teachers aside for good news. He leaned against the wall and asked how I was doing, and something about his kind expression made me crack. I told him about the diagnosis, about needing treatment starting next week, about needing to arrange coverage for chemotherapy days. He listened without interrupting, then told me the school would accommodate whatever I needed. Extended sick leave if necessary, reduced hours, whatever helped me focus on getting healthy. I started crying right there in the hallway between my classroom and the art room, and he handed me tissues from his pocket like he'd expected this. He said I'd been teaching at this school for 8 years, and they weren't losing me over logistics. I went back to my classroom feeling lighter than I had in days, like maybe I could actually do this. After school, I was packing my bag when Cornelia appeared in my doorway. She taught 3rd grade down the hall, and we'd been friends since I started working here. She walked straight over and hugged me without saying anything, and I realized Morris must have told her. She pulled back and said she'd heard about my diagnosis. I nodded because I couldn't speak yet. She sat on the edge of my desk and told me she'd had breast cancer 4 years ago. I'd known she'd been sick, but she'd never specified what kind, and now she was offering to help me navigate the practical parts of treatment that doctors don't always explain clearly. She talked about what to pack for chemotherapy sessions, which anti-nausea medications actually worked, how to deal with losing hair before it fell out in clumps. She made it sound manageable instead of impossible, and I felt grateful to have someone who understood what was coming. That evening, my phone started buzzing with calls from Keith's number. I'd blocked him after he left, but now he was calling from different numbers. Work phone. Numbers I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail. Then the emails started. Long messages about how he'd panicked and made terrible choices. How he loved me and wanted to fix things. How the stress of my diagnosis had broken something in his brain temporarily. I forwarded them all to Karen without reading past the first few lines. She called me that night and told me not to respond to anything. Every message he sent was documentation of his behavior, and responding would only complicate things legally. She said judges loved to see one party trying to communicate, while the other stayed silent and collected evidence. Ryan came over the next morning with paperwork for new bank accounts in only my name. We spent 3 hours changing every password and security question I had. Bank accounts, email, social media, credit cards, everything. He made me set up 2-factor authentication on everything important. The violation of having someone steal from me while I was dealing with cancer made me paranoid about every login and password. I kept thinking about how Keith had known all my security information because we'd shared everything for 12 years. Now I was changing it all and feeling like I couldn't trust anything to stay safe. Ryan kept reassuring me that we were protecting my assets now, but I felt exhausted by the time we finished. My parents showed up that afternoon with grocery bags full of food. They started unpacking in my kitchen while I sat at the table feeling overwhelmed by everyone taking care of me. My dad sat down across from me and cleared his throat 3 times before speaking. He told me they'd pulled together $5,000 from their savings to help with any expenses insurance didn't cover. I immediately started crying and trying to refuse because they were retired on fixed income. They needed that money for their own expenses and emergencies. My mom came over and put her hands on my shoulders. She said they wanted to help their daughter and I needed to let them do this. My dad added that they'd been saving for years, and this was exactly the kind of emergency they'd saved for. I took the check because refusing would hurt them, but I felt guilty accepting money from parents who had so little to spare. The morning of my first chemotherapy session arrived too fast. Cornelia had given me a list of things to bring and what to expect, but I was still scared when Ryan drove me to the oncology center. The waiting room had people in various stages of treatment, and I tried not to stare at anyone. A nurse called my name and led me to a room with recliners arranged in rows. She was patient while explaining every step of the process. How long the IV would take to place, what medications would go in first, how long the actual chemotherapy drugs would take to infuse, what side effects might hit immediately versus later. Ryan sat in the chair next to mine and held my hand when the nurse inserted the IV. The whole process took 4 hours, and I watched the clear bags drip slowly into my arm while trying not to think about poison flowing through my veins. Ryan stayed the entire time, reading articles on his phone and getting me water when I asked. I was grateful he was there because the anxiety would have been unbearable alone. The side effects hit hard that evening. I made it home feeling okay, then spent the next 2 days barely able to get off the couch. Everything hurt, and I was so tired I couldn't keep my eyes open. Nausea came in waves despite the anti-nausea medication. My mom came to stay with me, bringing homemade soup I couldn't eat. She just sat nearby reading her book while I dozed on and off. Having her there made me feel less alone even though I couldn't talk much. She'd get up to bring me water or crackers without me asking, like she knew what I needed before I did. Karen called on the 3rd day and told me she'd filed divorce papers. The filing cited Keith's financial abuse, adultery, and abandonment during medical crisis. She was also pursuing a separate civil suit for return of my portion of the stolen funds plus damages. The wire transfer had only returned the principal amount, but she wanted him to pay for what he'd done. She explained that the civil suit would take longer, but it was worth pursuing because his actions had caused measurable harm. I listened while lying on my couch feeling too sick to care much about legal strategy, but I trusted her to handle it. Keith's attorney responded within a week with a counteroffer. Brendan Austin tried to frame everything as a misunderstanding during a stressful time. He claimed Keith had made poor decisions while processing his wife's terminal diagnosis and deserved compassion. Karen called me laughing after she read the response. She said we weren't negotiating because we had recordings of everything Keith admitted. We were taking him for everything he deserved to lose. She sounded almost cheerful about destroying his legal position, and I felt a small spark of satisfaction through the exhaustion. I returned to work after recovering from the first treatment. Walking into my classroom felt surreal after being sick for days. My desk was covered with cards and drawings from my students, colorful papers with crayon messages saying they missed me and hoped I felt better. One little girl came up before class started and told me her grandma had cancer and was fine now. She said it so matter-of-factly, like cancer was just something that happened, and then you got better. I started crying right there in front of my whole class, but they were good tears for once. The kids looked concerned until I told them I was happy to be back, and then they went to their seats chattering about their weekend. Teaching felt normal and grounding after weeks of nothing but medical appointments and legal battles. Cornelia stopped by my classroom after school the next day, carrying a cloth bag filled with small packages. She set them on my desk and pulled out different teas, each one labeled in her neat handwriting. The ginger one helped most with nausea, she explained, and the peppermint settled her stomach when nothing else worked. She handed me a tin of candies that looked like little amber stones. These got her through the worst days when even water felt impossible to keep down. I thanked her and she sat on the edge of a student desk, her expression serious. She told me straight that treatment was going to get harder before it got easier. The second round hit worse than the first. The third worse than the second. My body would feel like it was breaking down because in some ways it was, but that meant the medicine was working. She didn't smile when she said it, and I appreciated that she wasn't trying to make it sound better than it was. She just made it sound survivable, which was what I needed to hear. She squeezed my hand before leaving and reminded me to text her anytime, even at 3 a.m. when the nausea kept me awake. 3 days later, I was writing vocabulary words on the whiteboard when the intercom crackled. The office secretary asked me to step into the hallway for a moment. I walked out and Morris was standing there with a security guard I recognized from morning duty. Morris told me Keith was in the front office demanding to see me. The security guard already had instructions not to let him pass the main entrance. I felt my stomach drop, but Morris put his hand on my shoulder. He said the school was my workplace and I had a right to feel safe here. Keith wasn't allowed on campus without my explicit permission, which I obviously wasn't giving. I walked to the window at the end of the hallway that overlooked the front parking lot. Keith was standing by his truck arguing with another security guard. His arms were moving wildly, and even from this distance I could tell he was angry. The guard pointed toward the exit and Keith threw his hands up but got in his truck. I watched him drive away and realized I'd been holding my breath. Morris stood next to me and said he'd already sent an email to all staff with Keith's photo, instructing everyone to call security immediately if he showed up again. Walking back to my classroom felt surreal because my students were working quietly on their reading assignments like nothing had happened, which for them, nothing had. My second chemotherapy appointment arrived faster than I wanted. Ryan drove me again, and I felt less scared this time because I knew what to expect. The same chair, the same IV process, the same 4-hour wait while the drugs dripped into my veins. The oncology nurse remembered me and asked how I'd handled the side effects from the first treatment. I told her about the exhaustion and nausea, and she adjusted my anti-nausea medication slightly. Ryan read articles on his phone and brought me water and crackers when I asked. The treatment itself felt almost routine, which was strange considering poison was flowing through my body. But driving home, I noticed my hair felt different when I ran my fingers through it. Looser somehow, like it wasn't quite attached anymore. That night, I found strands on my pillow and knew it was starting. The exhaustion hit harder this time. I called in sick for 2 days and barely left my couch. My mom came over with more soup and sat reading while I dozed. When I finally looked in the mirror, I saw how pale I'd gotten. My skin had a grayish tone and dark circles made my eyes look sunken. I looked sick for the first time, which felt worse than actually feeling sick. Karen called while I was lying on my couch trying to keep down toast. She sounded excited, which was unusual for her normally measured tone. Keith's employer had launched an internal investigation into his relationship with Brittany. Someone had sent the company detailed information about their affair, including dates and locations. Karen said she didn't send anything, and I told her I hadn't either. We both went quiet for a moment before she said it didn't matter who sent it, because the information was apparently accurate. The company had strict policies about supervisors dating subordinate employees, and Keith had violated them repeatedly. Brittany worked in his department and reported directly to him, which made it even worse. The investigation was ongoing, but Karen said it would likely result in termination for at least one of them, possibly both. I hung up and stared at my ceiling. I should probably feel guilty that Keith was facing consequences at work, but I couldn't find any guilt inside me. He'd stolen my money while I had cancer and run off with his girlfriend. Whatever happened to his career was his own doing. I suspected Ryan had sent the information, and I made a mental note to not ask him about it because I didn't want him to have to lie. 2 weeks later, Karen called again, this time angry. The discovery phase of the divorce had revealed something new. Keith had opened a credit card in both our names 2 weeks after my diagnosis. He'd charged $8,000 on it for the down payment on his truck and the resort trip with Brittany. My name was on the account, which meant I was legally responsible for half the debt. Karen was already drafting additional motions, and her voice had that sharp edge that meant she was truly furious. I listened to her outline her strategy while feeling nothing, completely numb. Every time I thought Keith had reached the bottom of how low he could go, he found a new basement level. $8,000 charged to my name while I was starting cancer treatment. Karen asked if I was okay, and I told her I was just tired of being surprised. She said she understood and promised to handle everything. After we hung up, I realized I wasn't even angry anymore, just empty. Keith's betrayals had stopped shocking me, and that felt like its own kind of loss. My third chemotherapy treatment came 3 weeks after the second one. I woke up that morning and found clumps of hair on my pillow. Not just strands anymore, but actual chunks. I ran my fingers through and more came out easily, like pulling cotton from a bag. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and tugged gently. Whole sections lifted away without any resistance. I called Cornelia and she came over within an hour carrying electric clippers. She said we could shave it all off now or wait for it to fall out gradually, but gradual was usually worse because finding hair everywhere was depressing. I chose to shave it. She set up a chair in my kitchen and draped a towel around my shoulders. The clippers buzzed and I watched in the hand mirror as she made the first pass. My hair fell in sheets onto the towel and floor. It took maybe 10 minutes to remove everything. When she finished, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. My head looked small and pale and my eyes seemed huge. I started crying and Cornelia hugged me tight. She told me it would grow back different, maybe better. That weekend, she took me wig shopping at a medical supply store that specialized in cancer patients. We tried on ridiculous options first because Cornelia insisted we needed to laugh. A bright red one that made me look like a cartoon character. A long blonde one that was clearly meant for someone much younger. Finally, we found a simple brown style close to my natural color and texture. It looked normal enough that most people wouldn't notice. The woman helping us adjusted it and showed me how to secure it properly. I bought two, one for regular wear and one backup. Wearing it felt strange but better than being completely bald. Karen called the following week with news that made me sit down hard. Keith had been fired from his job. The investigation concluded that his relationship with Brittany violated company policy and created a hostile work environment. Brittany had also been fired. Keith's attorney, Brendan, had apparently tried to blame me for ruining Keith's career by causing the investigation. Karen shut that down immediately by pointing out that Keith ruined his own career by having an affair with a subordinate employee and stealing from his cancer patient wife. She sounded satisfied when she told me this, like she'd enjoyed destroying that particular argument. I asked what this meant for the divorce, and she said it actually helped our case. Keith had no income now, which eliminated his claims about being the sole provider. It also proved he'd made terrible decisions that cost him everything, which supported our narrative that he was reckless and selfish. I hung up and felt something that might have been satisfaction. Keith had emptied our bank accounts to protect his future, and now he had no job, no wife, and a reputation destroyed by his own choices. 2 weeks later, I sat in the oncology center for my fourth treatment. The halfway point. Dr. Vickers came in before the nurse started my IV and showed me the latest scan results on his tablet. My tumors had shrunk by 60%. He pointed to the before and after images, and I could see the difference even without medical training. The masses that had looked so threatening in the first scan were noticeably smaller. He said my response to treatment was excellent, and we were on track for the best possible outcome. The relief hit me so hard I started crying right there in the treatment chair. Dr. Vickers patted my shoulder and said he knew it was hard, but I was doing everything right. My body was fighting back exactly how we hoped. The treatment itself felt brutal, though. The exhaustion was crushing now, accumulating with each session. I slept 12 hours a night and still felt tired all day. My appetite disappeared completely and food tasted like metal. My skin was dry and sensitive. My nails were brittle. Everything hurt in a vague, constant way. But my tumors were shrinking, which made all of it worthwhile. The mediator assigned to our divorce case reviewed all the evidence Karen had compiled. Financial records, Ryan's recordings, the credit card statements, everything. 2 days later, Karen called and said the mediator had spoken privately with Brendan. The mediator apparently told him that fighting this case was pointless given the overwhelming evidence against Keith. Brendan had advised Keith to accept Karen's settlement terms, which included returning my full half of all marital assets, plus $20,000 in damages for the financial abuse and emotional distress. Karen's terms also gave me the house, my complete portion of both our retirement accounts, one of our cars, and the damage payment. Keith would get the truck he'd stupidly bought with stolen money and his own retirement funds. Karen said Brendan was smart enough to recognize a losing battle. Keith had no defense for any of his actions, and continuing to fight would cost him more in legal fees than he'd save in assets. Keith's attorney called Karen the next morning and said Keith would accept the settlement. Keith apparently realized that dragging this out would cost him $30,000 or more in additional legal fees, and he'd still lose everything anyway. The settlement gave me almost everything I wanted. Our house that we'd bought together, but I'd made most of the mortgage payments on while Keith's businesses failed. My full share of retirement accounts that I'd contributed to steadily while Keith gambled away his bonuses. The car I actually drove instead of the truck he'd bought without asking me. $20,000 to partially compensate for what he'd put me through. Karen scheduled the final signing for the following week. She said Keith would sign his copy at Brendan's office and I'd sign mine at hers, so we wouldn't have to see each other. I thanked her for everything she'd done, and she told me she was proud of how I'd fought back. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet house and realized I felt relieved. Not happy exactly, but relieved that this part was finally ending. Keith had tried to destroy me when I was most vulnerable, and instead he destroyed himself. I was still here, still fighting, still surviving. Ryan called me 2 days later with news about Brittany. She'd dumped Keith the same week he lost his job, and apparently she was telling everyone at their former workplace that she had no idea he was married. Ryan's source was someone from Keith's old company who felt bad about what happened to me. I listened to Ryan relay the information and realized I felt nothing. No anger at Brittany for sleeping with my husband. No satisfaction that she'd abandoned him. Just a hollow emptiness where those emotions should be. I told Ryan I appreciated him keeping me informed, but I didn't care what either of them did anymore. I just wanted them gone from my life completely. He understood and promised to stop updating me unless it was legally necessary. The divorce finalized 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning. I signed the papers at Karen's office while Keith signed his at Brendan's, and we never had to see each other. Karen shook my hand and told me I'd fought well for myself. The settlement gave me almost everything I deserved. That evening, my parents came over with a small celebration dinner. Mom brought my favorite lasagna, and Dad picked up a cake from the bakery. We sat at my kitchen table eating and talking about normal things like the weather and my dad's garden. Halfway through dinner, I realized I felt relieved instead of sad. My parents kept watching me like they expected me to break down, but I just felt lighter. The marriage had died the moment Keith chose money over my life. The divorce just made it official on paper. Mom squeezed my hand and said she was proud of me. Dad nodded and cleared his throat the way he does when he's emotional, but doesn't want to show it. My 4th chemotherapy treatment hit me harder than the previous 3 combined. The exhaustion was crushing and the nausea was constant despite the medication. I couldn't keep anything down for 2 days straight. On the 3rd day, I tried to get out of bed and my legs gave out. Ryan found me on the bathroom floor barely conscious. He called an ambulance and I woke up in the hospital with an IV in my arm. The oncology nurse explained I was severely dehydrated and my electrolytes were dangerously low. They kept me overnight for observation and pumped fluids into me. Dr. Vickers came by the next morning and adjusted my anti-nausea medication to a stronger formula. The oncology nurse sat with me for 20 minutes teaching me better hydration strategies. She said I needed to drink small amounts constantly even when I felt sick, and gave me a list of drinks that would help replace electrolytes. She was patient and kind, writing everything down so I wouldn't forget. Ryan stayed with me the whole time, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair. When they released me the next afternoon, I felt weak but functional. Cornelia showed up at my house 2 days later with a schedule she'd printed out. She'd organized all my coworkers to bring me meals on a rotating basis during my worst treatment weeks. Different teachers would drop off dinner every night for the next month. I started crying because the kindness overwhelmed me. Cornelia hugged me and said that's what community does. She reminded me I'd helped cover her classes when her dad had his heart surgery last year. I'd forgotten about that because it seemed like such a small thing. But apparently people remembered. The meals started arriving that same evening. Simple things like soup and sandwiches that I could actually eat. Each person left the food on my porch with a quick text so I didn't have to socialize when I felt terrible. I realized I had a stronger support system than I'd known. Keith had isolated me from friends over the years, making me think I only had him. But my coworkers showed up when it mattered. A mutual friend named Jessica called me 3 weeks after the divorce finalized. She apologized for bothering me but said Keith had asked her to reach out. He wanted closure and to apologize properly. Jessica sounded uncomfortable delivering the message. I told her Keith got his closure when the divorce papers were signed. I had nothing to say to him ever, and I'd appreciate if she didn't contact me on his behalf again. She apologized again and promised she wouldn't. I blocked her number anyway because I didn't trust Keith not to keep trying. He'd lost everything through his own choices, and now he wanted forgiveness to make himself feel better. I didn't owe him that. My 5th chemotherapy session happened on a Thursday morning. I sat in the treatment chair for 4 hours while the drugs dripped into my veins. Dr. Vickers came by during the infusion to check on me. He pulled up my latest scans on his tablet and showed me the results. The tumors had shrunk by another 15% since last month. He said if this trend continued, I might avoid radiation treatment entirely. The possibility of finishing treatment sooner than expected gave me something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real hope that this nightmare might end and I could start rebuilding my life. Dr. Vickers smiled and said my body was responding exactly how he'd hoped. He reminded me I was doing everything right and the treatment was working. I cried in the chair after he left, but this time from relief instead of fear. I started feeling strong enough to think about next school year. Morris called me at home one evening to check in. I told him I wanted to return to teaching full-time in September if my treatment stayed on track. He said my job was completely secure regardless of how much time I needed. The school board had approved extended medical leave and my insurance had covered everything except small copays. He said the substitute teacher handling my class was doing fine, but the kids asked about me constantly. One student had made me a card that said, "Get well soon, Mrs. Teacher," with crayon drawings of flowers. Morris mailed it to me and I put it on my refrigerator. Planning for next year made me feel normal again. like I had a future beyond just surviving treatment. Ryan and Michaela came over for dinner on a Saturday night. Michaela is a nurse and she'd been researching post-treatment recovery plans for weeks. She brought a whole binder she'd created with information about rebuilding strength and immune system after chemotherapy ends. The binder had sections on nutrition, exercise, supplements, and follow-up care. She'd color-coded everything and included scientific studies to back up her recommendations. I was overwhelmed by how much work she'd put into helping me. Ryan said they wanted me healthy for the long term, not just cancer-free. Michaela walked me through the nutrition section, explaining which foods would help my body recover fastest. She'd even included easy recipes since I still got tired easily. I hugged her and thanked her for caring so much. She said I was family, and that's what family does. The settlement money from Keith arrived in my new bank account on a Monday morning. $44,000 from my half of our savings, plus the $20,000 in damages. I stared at the number on my phone screen for a long time. Then I transferred $15,000 into a separate account for any future medical expenses. The rest went toward rebuilding my emergency fund that Keith had destroyed. Karen called that afternoon to confirm I'd received the payment. She said I should feel proud of how I'd fought for myself through everything. I told her I couldn't have done it without her help. She said that's what good lawyers do. They fight for people who deserve justice. The money couldn't undo what Keith had done, but it meant I had financial security while I finished treatment and recovered. My sixth and final chemotherapy treatment happened 3 weeks later. I sat in the same chair I'd been sitting in for months, watching the same drugs drip into the same veins. But this time I knew it was the last time. The exhaustion was worse than ever because the treatments had built up in my system. My whole body ached and I could barely keep my eyes open. But I was also relieved to be done. No more poison pumped into my body every few weeks. No more counting down days until the next treatment. Dr. Vickers came by near the end of the session and scheduled my follow-up scans for 3 weeks out. Those scans would confirm whether the treatment had worked as well as we hoped. He said he was optimistic based on my progress so far. I left the cancer center that afternoon feeling like I'd survived something that should have killed me. Keith had tried to destroy me when I was most vulnerable. Instead, he'd destroyed himself while I kept fighting. I was still here, still alive, still moving forward. I spent the next 3 weeks mostly on the couch because my body was done fighting. The exhaustion wasn't like being tired after a long day. It was like someone had unplugged my battery and I couldn't recharge no matter how much I slept. My parents came over almost every day, and my mom would sit with me while I dozed on and off, bringing soup I could barely eat, and magazines I couldn't focus on. My dad showed up one Saturday morning with lumber and tools, saying he wanted to build me something for when I felt better. He spent the whole weekend in my backyard constructing raised garden beds, measuring and cutting and hammering while I watched through the window. When he finished, he came inside sweaty and proud, telling me I'd need a project once I got my energy back and growing vegetables would be perfect. I cried because it meant he believed I'd recover enough to need a hobby, and that simple faith felt huge when I could barely walk to the bathroom without getting winded. The beds sat empty for now, but they looked like possibility, like a future I might actually get to have. The follow-up scans happened on a Tuesday morning, and I was so nervous I threw up in the parking lot before going inside. The imaging took an hour, and then I had to wait 3 more days for results, which felt impossible, but I somehow survived them. Dr. Vickers called me into his office on Friday afternoon, and his face was smiling before he even spoke. The tumors had shrunk by 95%, and the remaining cells were so small, he was confident my immune system would eliminate them, now that it was recovering from treatment. I didn't need radiation, just monitoring scans every 3 months for the next 2 years to make sure nothing came back. I sat there staring at him because 95% felt unreal after months of poison and sickness and fear. He pulled up the scans on his computer and showed me the before and after images, pointing to where the tumors had been and how tiny they were now. The difference was obvious even to my untrained eyes, and I started crying right there in his office, big ugly sobs that I couldn't control. Dr. Vickers handed me tissues and waited patiently while I fell apart from relief instead of fear for the first time since this whole nightmare started. He said I did the hard work of getting through treatment, and my body responded exactly how they'd hoped it would. I thanked him about 20 times and he smiled, reminding me that plenty of patients don't respond this well, so I should feel proud of my results. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months, like maybe I actually was going to survive this after all. I called my parents from the car and my mom cried too, then put my dad on speaker so I could tell him the news. He cleared his throat a bunch of times and said he couldn't wait to help me plant those garden beds in spring. Cornelia took me out for lunch the next day to celebrate, and we went to a quiet cafe near school. She ordered us both fancy sandwiches and lemonade, then raised her glass in a toast to my scan results. We talked about her own cancer journey 4 years ago, and she was honest about how the first year after treatment felt emotionally complicated. She said I'd be processing everything I survived for a long time, and some days would feel surreal like it all happened to someone else. I asked if the fear of it coming back ever went away, and she admitted it never completely disappeared, but it got quieter with each clear scan. She told me to be patient with myself during recovery, because my body and mind both needed time to heal from the trauma. Sitting there with someone who truly understood what I'd been through made me feel less alone than I had in months. Cornelia had survived and built a good life after cancer, which meant maybe I could too. I returned to work part-time for the last month of the school year, and my students rushed to hug me the second I walked into the classroom. They'd made welcome back signs and covered my desk with drawings they'd created while I was gone. One boy raised his hand immediately and announced that my hair was growing back funny, which made the whole class laugh, including me. Kids are wonderfully honest in ways adults never are, and his comment felt refreshing after months of people tiptoeing around my appearance. My hair was growing back in weird patches and a slightly different texture than before, darker and curlier in spots. I told the class that chemo does strange things to hair and showed them the fuzzy growth, which they all wanted to touch. Teaching again felt normal and purposeful after months of just surviving, and I realized how much I'd missed these kids and this work that mattered. Morris called me into his office during my planning period and asked how I was handling being back. I told him honestly that I was tired but happy to be teaching again, and he nodded like he understood. He said I had options for next year if I needed them. I could return full-time, or continue part-time if I needed more recovery time. The school board had approved extended medical accommodations, and he wanted me to know I had full support either way. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds before telling him I wanted full-time, because teaching gave me purpose and structure that I'd missed desperately. He smiled and said he was glad to hear it because the kids needed me and I was a good teacher. I left his office feeling valued and secure in my job, which was something Keith had tried to take from me by insisting I'd never work again. Karen called me on a Wednesday afternoon with news that made me laugh out loud. Keith's attorney had contacted her one final time trying to reduce the damage payment, claiming Keith was struggling financially after losing his job. Karen's response was professional but brutal, basically saying Keith should have considered financial consequences before stealing from a cancer patient, and the case was closed. She said the $20,000 in damages was more than fair given what he'd done, and she wasn't negotiating down by even $1. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice when she told me Keith's attorney had accepted defeat and wouldn't be bothering us anymore. The settlement was final, and I'd never have to deal with Keith or his lawyer again. Karen reminded me that I'd fought for myself through everything and won, which was something to be proud of. I started attending a cancer survivor support group that Cornelia recommended, and the first meeting was awkward but helpful. Sitting in a circle with 10 other people who'd been through similar battles made me feel less isolated in my experience. Several people shared stories about relationship betrayals during treatment, and I wasn't alone in having a partner abandon me when I got sick. One woman's husband left her during radiation. Another man's wife cleaned out their accounts just like Keith had done to me. Hearing their stories was validating because it meant I wasn't uniquely unlucky or somehow at fault for Keith's choices. The group leader said betrayal during illness was unfortunately common, and processing that pain was just as important as physical recovery. I shared my story briefly, and people nodded with understanding that only fellow survivors could offer. My 3-month follow-up scan happened in early June, and I was less terrified this time but still nervous. The wait for results was only 2 days, and when Dr. Vickers called me in, his smile told me everything before he spoke. The scan was completely clear with no sign of cancer anywhere in my body. He said the words officially. I was in remission. Remission felt huge and terrifying and wonderful all at once, like I could finally believe I was going to survive this. Dr. Vickers scheduled my next scan for 3 months out and said if I stayed clear for 2 years, we could reduce monitoring to once a year. I walked out of the cancer center feeling like I'd been given my life back after months of it being held hostage by disease and treatment. I decided to sell the house because every room held bad memories of Keith's betrayal. My parents came over to help me pack, and my dad sorted through the garage while my mom tackled the kitchen with me. We worked through closets and cabinets, boxing up 15 years of accumulated life and deciding what to keep versus donate. Ryan showed up with his truck to haul away furniture I didn't want anymore, and he mentioned he'd been looking at smaller houses closer to my school. He found one that had just listed, a 2-bedroom with a yard and updated kitchen, priced within my budget from the settlement money. We drove over that afternoon, and I fell in love with it immediately because it felt like a fresh start with no ghosts of my failed marriage haunting the walls. I made the offer on the house the same day, and the seller accepted within hours because the market was slow, and I was paying cash from the settlement. Closing happened 3 weeks later, and I got the keys on a sunny morning in late June, standing on the front porch of a place that belonged only to me. The house needed paint, and the kitchen cabinets were outdated, and one bathroom had ugly tile, but none of it mattered because Keith had never set foot here. I spent the first week just cleaning and planning what colors to paint each room, measuring windows for curtains and making lists of supplies I needed. My parents came over with painting supplies, and my dad showed me how to properly prep walls while my mom washed all the windows until they sparkled. We painted the living room a warm cream color, and my bedroom a soft blue, and I cried a little when I realized I was choosing colors I actually liked, instead of compromising with Keith's opinions. Ryan helped me move my furniture from storage and set up my bed, and standing in my own bedroom in my own house felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in months. I painted the second bedroom pale yellow, thinking maybe someday I'd have guests, or turn it into a craft room, and the act of planning a future felt strange but good. The kitchen got white paint and new cabinet hardware, and I hung curtains I picked out myself in patterns Keith would have hated. Every room I finished felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that cancer and Keith's betrayal had tried to take away. Michaela came over in early July with a binder she'd made about post-cancer health, filled with nutrition information and exercise plans designed for people recovering from treatment. She sat at my new kitchen table and walked me through meal planning focused on foods that support immune system recovery and reduce inflammation. We made a grocery list together, and she showed me how to prep healthy meals in batches, so I'd have good food ready when I was tired. She suggested starting with short walks every morning, just 10 or 15 minutes at first, gradually building up stamina without pushing too hard. The next morning, I walked around my neighborhood for 12 minutes and came home exhausted but proud that I'd done it. Each day I added a minute or two, and by the end of July, I was walking 30 minutes every morning, actually enjoying the movement and fresh air. My energy started coming back in small increments, not the crushing exhaustion that had defined the past 6 months. Michaela checked in weekly to see how I was feeling and adjust the plan, and having her medical expertise combined with her personal care made all the difference. I started sleeping better and waking up without that immediate dread that had been my constant companion during treatment. Food tasted normal again instead of metallic or bland, and I found myself actually hungry for meals instead of forcing myself to eat. My hair started growing back in August, and I was shocked at how different it looked coming in. The texture was completely different, wavy instead of straight, and the color was darker than before with less of the light brown highlights I'd always had. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, touching the short, fuzzy growth and feeling like I was meeting a stranger who happened to live in my body. Cornelia told me her hair had changed too and said it was common after chemo, something about the treatment affecting hair follicles. I decided I liked the darker color and the wave, and it felt symbolic somehow that I was physically different from the person who got diagnosed 10 months ago. That version of me had been married to Keith and believed our life together was solid, and this version knew better about everything. I wasn't the same woman who sat in that hospital parking lot crying while her husband stole their savings. I was someone who'd fought through hell and come out stronger. The physical change in my hair felt like visible proof of how much I'd changed internally, like my body was announcing I'd survived something that tried to destroy me. School started in late August, and I was back full-time with a new classroom on the second floor with better windows. Morris had arranged for me to have a lighter course load my first semester back. Fewer students per class so I wouldn't be overwhelmed. Walking into my classroom the first day felt surreal after months of hospital rooms and treatment centers, like returning to a normal life I'd thought was gone forever. My students were excited to have me back, and several had made welcome back cards over summer, which made me tear up reading them. Teaching felt meaningful in a completely different way than before, like I was grateful for every normal moment instead of taking it for granted. Explaining math concepts to 10-year-olds and helping them with homework problems seemed precious after spending months wondering if I'd ever do this again. I found myself more patient with difficult students and more appreciative of small victories, like when a struggling kid finally understood fractions. Every ordinary day at the school felt like a gift I'd almost lost, and I stopped complaining about paperwork or difficult parents because at least I was alive to deal with those problems. My 6-month follow-up scan happened in September, and I was less scared this time but still nervous waiting for results. The scan was completely clear and the tumors were gone, and when I saw those words on the report, I sat in my car and cried for 20 minutes. I called my parents first and heard my mom's voice break with relief, then called Ryan, who said he never doubted I'd beat this thing. The fear of recurrence was still there in the back of my mind because cancer is never truly gone, just in remission, but each clear scan made that fear a little smaller. I knew I'd probably always worry before scans and hold my breath waiting for results, but that seemed like a fair price for being alive. I celebrated by buying myself a nice dinner and eating it in my house surrounded by the rooms I'd painted, feeling proud of everything I'd survived. I ran into Brittany at the grocery store in October, and she was in the produce section when I turned the corner with my cart. She saw me and her face went pale, and she quickly turned away, pretending to be very interested in apples. I realized standing there that I didn't feel angry at her anymore, just completely indifferent, like she was a stranger I vaguely recognized. She'd been part of the worst period of my life, but she wasn't important enough to waste emotional energy hating. I finished my shopping and left without saying anything to her, and driving home I felt lighter knowing I'd reached that point of genuine not caring. Seeing her uncomfortable and hurrying away felt like its own small victory, proof that she knew what she'd done was wrong even if Keith never would. Ryan and Michaela invited me to dinner in November and announced they were expecting a baby due in May. I hugged them both and cried happy tears this time, overwhelmed with joy at becoming an aunt. The timing felt perfect somehow, celebrating new life after I'd spent months fighting for my own. Michaela was glowing, and Ryan was nervous and excited, and sitting at their table talking about baby names and nursery colors felt like the best possible future. I offered to help however they needed, and Michaela joked that I'd be the favorite aunt who spoils the baby. Driving home that night, I felt grateful to be alive to meet my niece or nephew, to be part of this new chapter for my family. Cornelia approached me in December about volunteering with a local cancer support organization that helped newly diagnosed patients. She'd been volunteering for 2 years and thought I might want to join her now that I was in remission. We started going together twice a month to meet with people just beginning treatment, answering questions and sharing our experiences. Being able to help others navigate what I'd been through gave me a sense of purpose beyond just surviving. One woman cried when I told her about Keith and said her husband had been distant since her diagnosis, and I could offer her resources and support that I wished I'd had earlier. Helping scared patients understand what to expect and assuring them they could get through it felt like using my worst experience to create something good. My parents came over for dinner in January, and my dad pulled me aside to say he was proud of how I'd handled everything. He admitted he'd wanted to do much worse to Keith than Ryan's legal approach, and I could hear the anger in his voice that anyone had treated his daughter that way. My mom hugged me and said watching me fight through cancer and divorce simultaneously had shown her a strength she didn't know I had. I realized sitting with them in my little house that my family had shown up for me in every way that mattered when I needed them most. They'd given money they couldn't afford, time they didn't have, and unwavering support through the darkest period of my life. I went on a few casual dates in February, meeting guys through a dating app and going for coffee or dinner. None of them felt like anything serious, and I realized I wasn't ready for a relationship, maybe wouldn't be for a long time. I was focused on my health with regular scans every 3 months, my teaching career that felt meaningful again, my family who'd proven their love, and rebuilding my life on terms I chose. Being single felt peaceful instead of lonely, like I needed time to just be myself without considering anyone else's needs or opinions. I was learning to be happy alone in my house, walking every morning, teaching my students, volunteering with cancer patients, and spending time with people who actually cared about me. Keith's betrayal had tried to destroy me, but instead it had shown me exactly who I was when everything was stripped away, and I liked the person I'd become through surviving. My 9-month scan appointment arrived in March, and I sat in the waiting room feeling less scared than I used to. Dr. Vickers called me back and walked me through the results showing completely clear images. He told me we could reduce my monitoring schedule to every 6 months now instead of every 3 months. I nodded and felt something shift inside me, because the cancer was starting to feel like something that happened to me in the past, rather than something defining who I was right now. Driving home, I realized I'd gone whole days recently without thinking about being sick, without checking my body for new symptoms, without that constant fear sitting in my chest. The clear scan felt like permission to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop and just live my life again. I finished the last renovations on my house in April, and the place finally felt complete. New paint in every room, updated kitchen cabinets, refinished hardwood floors that gleamed in the sunlight. I decided to host Thanksgiving dinner for everyone who'd supported me through the worst year of my life. My parents arrived first with homemade pies, then Ryan and Michaela showed up with their new baby girl who was 6 months old and perfect. Cornelia came with her husband and 2 kids, bringing wine and stories that made everyone laugh. We sat around my dining room table in my house that I'd bought with settlement money from Keith's betrayal, and I looked at all these faces. These were the people who'd shown up when I was bald and sick and scared, who'd brought me food and driven me to appointments and held me while I cried. Sitting there surrounded by them felt like the truest measure of wealth I'd ever known, better than any bank account balance. A former student's parent contacted me in early December through the school office. Her daughter had been in my class 3 years ago, and apparently the mom had heard about my cancer journey through the parent network. She'd made a donation to the cancer support organization where Cornelia and I volunteered, specifically in my name to help other newly diagnosed patients. The amount was generous, but what got me was the note she included saying my strength had inspired her family. Small acts of kindness like that from my community kept reminding me that most people were genuinely good, even when one person had tried to destroy me at my lowest point. I was healthy now with clear scans and energy that felt normal again. My bank accounts were rebuilding with money I'd earned and saved myself. My house was mine alone, decorated exactly how I wanted it. I had my teaching career that gave me purpose every single day. My family loved me unconditionally and showed up when it mattered. Keith's betrayal could have broken me completely, could have left me bitter and afraid and convinced the world was cruel. Instead, it showed me my own strength that I didn't know I had until I needed it. It revealed who truly mattered in my life, and who deserved to be cut out permanently. I wasn't just surviving anymore, wasn't just getting through each day waiting for the next disaster. I was actually thriving, genuinely happy with the life I'd built from the ashes of everything Keith tried to take from me. That felt like the best possible outcome after everything I'd fought through this year, proof that sometimes the worst things that happen to you can show you exactly who you are and what you're capable of becoming.